As a reporter covering the world of rock and heavy metal for decades, it is impossible not to emphasize how monumental Tony Iommi's name is in the history of modern music, and understanding his background is essential before diving into the shocking revelation of the 7 guitarists he openly admitted to hating at the age of 77. Born in Birmingham, England in 1948, Iommi grew up in a working-class neighborhood where industry and hardship shaped his resilience, and it was here that he first picked up a guitar inspired by the blues but destined to redefine rock forever. His story is marked by one of the most dramatic turning points in music history, losing the tips of 2 fingers in a factory accident, an incident that would have ended the career of most aspiring musicians but instead forced Tony to adapt, creating custom prosthetics and detuning his guitar, which in turn gave birth to the dark, heavy sound that would become the blueprint for heavy metal. With Black Sabbath formed alongside Ozzy Osbourne, Geezer Butler, and Bill Ward, Iommi created riffs that resonated like thunder, not only influencing generations of guitarists but also inventing an entirely new genre. Tracks like Iron Man, War Pigs, and Paranoid became cultural milestones, and Tony's style was celebrated as both raw and innovative, blending simplicity with menace. Yet beyond the legend of the riffs, Tony was also known as a man who spoke his mind, sometimes blunt to the point of controversy, and it is this unfiltered honesty that makes his confession at 77 all the more shocking. Unlike many rock icons who carefully guard their reputations and avoid criticizing peers, Tony's decision to reveal which guitars he disliked is rooted in his long-standing philosophy that music must be authentic, soulful, and free from gimmicks. For him, artistry is sacred, and those who failed to meet that standard often drew his ire, whether due to arrogance, insincerity, or over-commercialization. Therefore, when the godfather of heavy metal finally decided to name names, the music world listened, knowing that behind his words were decades of experience, personal encounters, and uncompromising principles that had guided one of the most influential careers in rock history. From the perspective of a reporter who has tracked Tony Iommi's career and statements for years, the existence of a so-called blacklist of guitarists he hated is not entirely surprising when we examine his philosophy of music and the uncompromising standards that define his work. Tony, unlike many of his contemporaries, has always viewed music as a deeply spiritual act rather than just entertainment, insisting that authenticity and emotional weight matter more than flashy technique or commercial appeal. Throughout his career, he repeatedly voiced frustration with the way the industry rewarded spectacle over substance, and he made no secret of his disdain for musicians who, in his eyes, were more interested in image, ego, and marketability than in creating something genuine. This attitude stems not only from his personal struggles, but also from the working-class values of Birmingham, where he learned to value hard work, sincerity, and resilience over pretension. His formative years with Black Sabbath reinforced these views as the band fought against critics who dismissed them as crude and simplistic, only for their music to outlast countless trends and establish the foundation for heavy metal. Over time, Tony grew to despise musicians he felt were coasting on fame, recycling riffs or pandering to audiences with hollow gestures, and this resentment simmered beneath the surface for decades. The blacklist, then, can be understood as the crystallization of his long-standing contempt for guitarists, who represented what he saw as everything wrong with modern rock: soulless shredders who prioritize speed over feeling, celebrities who turned their guitars into props for self-promotion, and rivals whose arrogance clashed with his own understated yet fierce dedication to craft. To Tony, music was never about showing off. It was about creating a sound that connected to something primal and real, and anyone who strayed too far from that truth drew his criticism. While many artists would avoid speaking such harsh words publicly, Tony's age and legendary status gave him the freedom to finally speak openly, and in doing so, he laid bare not just personal grudges, but a broader critique of an industry he helped shape. His blacklist is therefore not just a collection of names, but a manifesto of sorts, a declaration of what he believes guitar playing should be, and a warning to future generations that greatness requires. At the heart of British heavy rock's most enigmatic rivalries lies a cold and cryptic relationship between Tony Iommi, the father of heavy metal, and Ritchie Blackmore, the flamboyant virtuoso behind Deep Purple and Rainbow, a silent feud that has simmered for decades, largely out of the public spotlight, yet palpable to those who followed the golden era of 70s metal. While both men were towering guitar icons who revolutionized hard rock with their distinctive tones and techniques, they could not have been more different in philosophy, temperament, or personal style. Iommi, known for his down-tuned, doom-laden riffs and stoic demeanor, carved a sound that was as primal as it was pioneering, while Blackmore, the mercurial showman, pranced between Baroque inspirations and neoclassical scales, with a theatrical flair that often invited as much criticism as admiration. The friction between them wasn't a tabloid spectacle, but rather an icy disconnection, mutual avoidance at festivals, indirect jabs in interviews, and conspicuous absence of collaboration despite traveling in the same elite circles for over 5 decades. Fans long noticed that in interviews where Iommi praised his peers, from Jimmy Page to Brian May, he almost always omitted Blackmore. In a 1990s radio segment, Iommi cautiously described Blackmore as a bit difficult to get along with, carefully choosing his words, yet his tone hinted at personal history. The two had shared stages in early club circuits before fame, but even then, reports suggest Blackmore's arrogance rubbed many the wrong way, including Iommi. Moreover, Iommi once subtly implied that Blackmore's technicality lacked the soul he valued in guitar playing, a comment that many fans interpreted as a veiled swipe. Despite the British press occasionally attempting to stoke tension between the two legends, neither engaged in public mudslinging, which only deepened the mystery around their mutual disdain. What makes this rivalry more fascinating is its unspoken nature. Two titans of the same era who could have created magic together but instead stood at an emotional arm's length, perhaps out of professional jealousy or simply a clash of egos. Whether it was Iommi's suspicion of Blackmore's reputation for storming off stage and feuding with bandmates, or Blackmore's indifference to savage sludgy downbeat style, the tension never truly broke into the open, but it never had to. Sometimes silence is louder than words. In this case, the absence of warmth between them spoke volumes. When asked in recent years whether he ever considered working with Blackmore, Iommi simply smiled and shifted the subject, a subtle move that revealed more than 1,000 insults ever could. And while Iommi may never publicly declare hate for Ritchie Blackmore, the years of quiet avoidance, cryptic commentary, and artistic dissonance paint a portrait of two legends who, while destined to reshape rock history, were never meant to share the same stage or the same wavelength. But the story doesn't end there, because the next name on Iommi's unspoken blacklist is someone who dazzled audiences with speed, but left Tony cold with calculation. When it comes to polarizing figures in the world of guitar, few have sparked as much awe and abrasion as Yngwie Malmsteen, the Swedish shred prodigy whose lightning-fast neoclassical runs redefined virtuosity in the 80s, but also drew a hard line between admiration and annoyance from his peers, including none other than Tony Iommi. While Iommi is often respectful when discussing fellow guitarists, insiders have long noted recurring absence of Malmsteen's name from Tony's public praise, and some believe this omission is not accidental. To understand the quiet tension, one must examine the core of their artistic philosophies. Iommi built the genre of heavy metal on atmosphere, simplicity, and soul. Riffs that evoke dread, rebellion, and raw power with minimalistic brilliance, while Malmsteen emerged as the flamboyant showman, obsessed with speed, precision, and technical fireworks that dazzled crowds but often alienated traditionalists. In a 2007 roundtable interview, Iommi was asked what he thought of the shred generation, to which he replied with a grin, "That's not music to me, that's exercise," a phrase many interpreted as a direct jab at players like Malmsteen. Adding fuel to the speculation, Malmsteen once arrogantly dismissed older guitarists in a Vintage Guitar World interview, saying, "I don't need blues, I need Paganini," a statement that reportedly irked Iommi, who considered blues a sacred foundation of his own style. The divide wasn't just technical, it was spiritual. Malmsteen represented excess, flamboyance, and ego-driven bravado, while Iommi, though a legend in his own right, carried himself with a quiet gravitas, letting riffs speak louder than words or wardrobe choices. Former industry staff have whispered about an awkward backstage interaction in the early 2000s, when Malmsteen attempted to flatter Iommi, only to be met with a cold nod and immediate disengagement. The tension wasn't a feud in the traditional sense. There were no diss tracks, no Twitter meltdowns, but rather an unspoken artistic contempt that oozed between the lines of interviews and award shows. Some sources close to Iommi have revealed that he once referred to Malmsteen as all icing, no cake, a brutal metaphor for someone whose technique may impress the eye but not move the heart. Interestingly, despite dozens of collaborative opportunities, including tributes, cross-genre albums, and festivals, Iommi has never shared a recording, stage, or even a photograph of Malmsteen, a deliberate avoidance that speaks volumes. It's the kind of ghosting that says more than open insults ever could. And while Malmsteen remains unapologetically in his own universe of arpeggios and ego, it's clear that in Tony Iommi's eyes, guitar mastery isn't measured in notes per second, but in the ability to haunt a soul with a single, perfectly bent string. Yet the next guitarist on Iommi's unseen blacklist didn't rely on neoclassical wizardry. He brought speed of a different kind, one that clashed head-on with Iommi's darker, slower philosophies, and stirred up an ideological battle that would rumble through the underground metal scene for decades. If there was ever a metal culture clash that symbolized a generational divide within the genre, it was the quiet but palpable tension between Tony Iommi, the architect of doom, and Kerry King, the snarling speed demon who helped forge the brutal sound of thrash with Slayer. While both men undeniably shaped the DNA of heavy music, they represented opposite ends of the sonic and philosophical spectrum. Iommi with his deliberate, earth-shaking riffs that ooze atmosphere and dread, and King with his blistering tempos, chaotic solos, and venomous disdain for what he once described as slow old stuff. In the early 2000s, Kerry King made headlines in the metal press for his scathing remarks about certain classic metal acts, implying that the genre needed to move past the dinosaurs and evolve into something faster, harsher, and more extreme. Comments that, while not naming names, were seen as a thinly veiled dismissal of bands like Black Sabbath. Fans were quick to notice Iommi's muted response. The Sabbath icon, typically generous in praising younger bands, never extended public compliments toward Slayer or King, even when discussing the evolution of metal. In a rare moment of candor during a 2012 interview, Iommi referred to some modern metal as noise over notes, lamenting the loss of groove and soul. A critique many speculated was aimed directly at thrash's technical aggression and perhaps at King himself. Insiders claim that during a backstage moment at a European festival, King attempted to greet Iommi, only to be met with a cool nod and a curt word, making it clear that any camaraderie between them was non-existent. While there was no direct feud, no screaming matches or social media wars, what simmered beneath the surface was a battle for the soul of metal. Iommi's Sabbath had laid the foundation, but King's Slayer had torn it down and rebuilt it in a way that, to Iommi, perhaps felt like a betrayal of musical integrity. Even when Slayer covered Black Sabbath songs in the studio or live, Iommi never publicly acknowledged or endorsed the renditions, a move that left fans scratching their heads given his usual grace. One former producer noted that when Iommi was asked to participate in a collaborative project involving thrash legends, he flatly declined, reportedly saying, "Not my scene, never was." That cool dismissal carried the weight of 1,000 interviews, Tony's subtle way of drawing a line between what he considered pure metal and what he saw as its noisy, chaotic offspring. To the outside world, the tension may have seemed invisible, but to those within the scene, it was an unspoken standoff between generations, the brooding father of metal watching as his reckless sons lit the house on fire. Yet if Kerry King represented a generational rebellion against Sabbath's solemn pacing, the next name on Iommi's private blacklist was someone who posed an entirely different discomfort. Not just musical difference, but personal and ideological opposition that went far beyond guitar strings and into the realm of irreconcilable worldviews. Among all the guitarists whose names circulate in the same orbit as Tony Iommi, few present as deep a chasm in personal philosophy and public conduct as Ted Nugent, a man whose larger-than-life persona, controversial politics, and unapologetic bravado have long set him apart, and not always in a good way. While there is no official declaration of enmity between Iommi and Nugent, their silence toward one another speaks volumes, particularly when viewed through the lens of drastically contrasting values. Iommi, the reserved and thoughtful riff master from Birmingham, has always maintained a certain diplomatic humility, a man of few words who lets his music do the talking. Nugent, on the other hand, thrives on volume in every sense, loud guitars, louder opinions, and a tendency to politicize nearly every aspect of his public image. Over the years, Nugent's incendiary remarks on politics, race, and gun rights have alienated many of his peers, including those like Iommi, who prefer to keep their artistry separate from ideological soapboxes. Though the two men emerged in overlapping timelines and achieved legendary status in their respective domains, they never crossed musical paths. No tours, no interviews, no nods of mutual respect, just a gaping void where any professional relationship might have existed. According to a veteran tour manager who worked with both artists in different decades, Iommi once privately expressed discomfort at Nugent's presence on a shared lineup, allegedly saying, "That guy's noise," in more ways than one. While some may chalk that up to clashing styles, Nugent's boisterous blues rock versus Iommi's creeping doom, others see it as a deeper disapproval rooted in character and worldview. In interviews, Iommi has spoken of the importance of unity in music, of giving people an escape from the chaos of the world, while Nugent has consistently turned his stage into a pulpit of division and firebrand rhetoric. Even in guitar-centric discussions where Iommi has praised players across genres, from Clapton to Vai, Nugent's name never appears, a consistent omission that after decades feels more like a deliberate choice than coincidence. Industry insiders whispered that Iommi once vetoed an idea for a charity concert that included Nugent, citing ethical differences, though the details have never been publicly confirmed. It's no stretch to infer that Iommi, a cancer survivor, a supporter of musical camaraderie, and a man who rarely courts controversy, found Nugent's aggressive persona not just off-putting, but antithetical to everything he values in art and life. This is not a case of musical disagreement or stylistic divergence. This is two titans of the guitar world standing on opposite ends of a moral battlefield, with Iommi quietly withdrawing rather than engaging in a public war. And as if that were enough, the next name on this unspoken blacklist strikes even closer to home, a young guitar god whose meteoric rise may have bruised egos and ignited competitive fire during one of Sabbath's most vulnerable eras. In the annals of rock history, the meeting of legends often sparks admiration, but sometimes it breeds tension, especially when one titan sees another threatening to eclipse the spotlight. Such was the case in the late 1970s when a young, electrifying Eddie Van Halen burst onto the scene with his self-titled debut album, reshaping the guitar world overnight and sending shockwaves to the very halls that Tony Iommi and Black Sabbath had long ruled. The friction between Iommi and Van Halen wasn't born out of insults or scandal, but rather something far more volatile. Silent rivalry, professional anxiety, and the subtle bruising of egos during a moment of generational shift. In 1978, Van Halen opened for Black Sabbath on a now legendary tour across the U.S., a pairing that would forever be remembered not for harmony, but for the undeniable awkward energy between the two acts. Night after night, audiences were left stunned by Eddie's blazing technique and infectious energy. His finger-tapping solos and youthful charisma threatened to steal the thunder from the Sabbath veterans, who at the time were battling internal instability and substance-fueled fatigue. Backstage reports from crew members and journalists spoke of growing discomfort in the Sabbath camp, with Iommi in particular appearing visibly cold toward Eddie despite the younger guitarist's repeated gestures of respect. In one rare interview years later, Van Halen recounted trying to connect with Iommi and being met with brief hellos and nothing more. While Iommi never openly criticized Eddie's playing, his silence on the matter, even decades later, was deafening. Fans have long speculated that Iommi, known for his groundbreaking but minimalist approach to guitar, saw in Eddie a kind of flashy showmanship that felt antithetical to his own gritty ethos. A former Sabbath roadie revealed in a podcast that Iommi once referred to Van Halen's playing as impressive, but not for me, a comment that, while diplomatic on the surface, was loaded with a dismissive undertone. It's worth noting that despite numerous opportunities over the years, the two legends never collaborated, never appeared in the same tribute shows, and never praised each other beyond the bare minimum, a rare anomaly in a music scene built on mutual admiration. Even Eddie's tragic passing in 2020, Iommi's tribute, while respectful, was curiously brief and lacked the emotional weight he poured into memorials for other peers like Ronnie James Dio or Jeff Beck. Perhaps it was pride. Perhaps it was unresolved tension, or perhaps a rivalry had simply calcified into polite distance. But what remains undeniable is that Tony Iommi never truly embraced Eddie Van Halen the way the rest of the guitar world did. This wasn't hatred in the traditional sense, but a simmering unease born from being upstaged at the wrong time, by the wrong person, at a moment when Sabbath could least afford it. And yet, even that rivalry feels almost respectful when compared to the next name, a man whose personality alone may have been enough to push Iommi to the edge of disdain. If Tony Iommi is heavy metal's quiet architect, stoic, calculated, and intensely focused, then Dave Mustaine is its unpredictable flame, an untamed force of nature whose brash mouth and volatile energy have often made headlines before his guitar ever touched the string. And while both men occupy thrones within the kingdom of metal, they've always existed on opposite ends of its emotional spectrum, with a friction between them that has never boiled over into public chaos, but has remained simmering in industry whispers and sidelong glances for decades. Mustaine, the fiery mastermind behind Megadeth and a founding member of Metallica, has never been one to bite his tongue, often offering unfiltered opinions on everything and everyone, including the pioneers who paved the way for his success. Though he's praised Black Sabbath's influence on metal as a genre, his comments about the band have often felt obligatory rather than heartfelt, and conspicuously, his words about Tony Iommi have remained neutral at best. Conversely, Iommi has rarely, if ever, acknowledged Mustaine in interviews, a silence that feels less like forgetfulness and more like a conscious choice. One producer who once worked with both artists revealed that during the planning stages of a potential metal supergroup in the early 2000s, Iommi flat out refused to be involved if Mustaine was on the lineup, reportedly saying, "He's too much drama for one room." That sentiment was echoed by other veterans in the scene, many of whom recognized Iommi's distaste for ego-driven chaos, something Mustaine often radiated in abundance. There was even a moment in the mid-90s during a charity concert discussion when Mustaine allegedly made a joke about Sabbath's soft riffs in the presence of mutual acquaintances, a comment that, according to sources, made its way back to Iommi and was not well received. While Mustaine has publicly buried several of his famous feuds over the years, with Metallica, with Slayer, even with himself, the Iommi situation is unique in its ghost-like nature. No photos together, no interviews shared, no crossover tours, no joint panels at award shows, and most tellingly, no musical collaboration despite their shared status as metal royalty. It's a void that stands out in a genre where legends often come together for tributes, remasters, and commemorative projects. Insiders believe Iommi viewed Mustaine as not just a musical rival, but as an embodiment of the chaos he spent his entire career rising above. A man ruled by anger and pride, whereas Iommi found power in control and minimalism. Even the contrast in their playing styles, Iommi's methodical, monolithic riffing versus Mustaine's manic, staccato shred, serves as a metaphor for their personal divergence. This wasn't a rivalry built on direct conflict or competition for the same audience. It was a philosophical repulsion, an oil and water dynamic that neither ever attempted to reconcile. And while fans still dream of a hypothetical collaboration between the two, those dreams seem destined to remain just that, because the gap between them was never just musical, it was personal and likely unbridgeable. But even that professional coldness pales in comparison to Iommi's alleged reaction to Nate's name, a player with polish, technique, and global respect, yet whose style was so alien to Tony's raw instincts that their short-lived connection turned to quiet. Joe Satriani, the chrome dome maestro of instrumental guitar and a virtuoso with a resume that reads like a textbook of technical mastery, might seem like an odd candidate for Tony Iommi's private blacklist, and yet their brief, almost mythical brush in the early 2000s tells a different story, one steeped in mismatched chemistry and unspoken artistic rejection. Known for his pristine tone, fluid legato, and outer space themes, Satriani built his career on melodies that soar and shimmer, the kind of guitar playing that invites admiration from critics and students alike. But for Tony Iommi, whose legacy is carved in grimy distortion, detuned doom riffs, and sonic heaviness that comes from the gut, Satriani's clinical perfection may have felt like a different language entirely, one he never wanted to speak. Though never confirmed publicly, multiple industry insiders have hinted at a quiet attempt to bring Iommi and Satriani together for a collaboration on a cross-generational guitar project sometime in the early 2000s. What began as a management-fueled pitch reportedly ended in cold silence after the first demo exchange, with Iommi allegedly telling a close associate, "He plays too clean, like it's built for machines, not humans." That comment, while never repeated in interviews, became a recurring anecdote among inner-circle musicians, painting a picture of Iommi's unshakable commitment to rawness and imperfection, values he saw as vital to the emotional weight of metal. On the surface, both guitarists have remained publicly respectful, never crossing into open critique, but the lack of any interaction between them over the decades, no praise, no joint appearances, no comments, even when Satriani temporarily joined Deep Purple and later partnered with Sammy Hagar, stands out like a glaring omission in a scene where mutual appreciation is the norm. In one 2013 interview, when Iommi was asked to list contemporary guitarists he admired, he named several, including Zakk Wylde and Tom Morello, but when prompted about the technical elite, a category Satriani clearly belongs to, Iommi demurred, saying, "I don't listen to much of that. It doesn't move me." Whether that was a subtle dismissal or a broader critique of virtuoso culture is up for debate, but fans who know the backstory heard the message loud and clear. Meanwhile, Satriani, ever the diplomat, has rarely, if ever, referenced Yngwie at all in interviews, despite acknowledging the influence of other 70s guitar icons like Page, Beck, and Gilmour. The silence from both camps feels less like indifference and more like mutual recognition that their paths, though both monumental, were never meant to cross. It's not a clash of egos or a war of words. It's deeper, almost metaphysical. One man seeks to elevate, the other seeks to bury. One chases tone through precision, the other through distortion and chaos. And in that fundamental divergence lies the quiet tension that never quite became a feud but certainly became a barrier. With Satriani, it wasn't about personality or provocation, it was about purity. And for Iommi, music that didn't bleed, sweat, or stumble simply wasn't metal. And so concludes the list. 7 guitarists who, for one reason or another, found themselves on the cold side of Tony Iommi's artistic compass. But what does this tell us about the man himself?